All right, with this we begin this sort of second phase of our debate. As I suggested before, we're not going to be able to have open questions from the floor. Instead, the society has designed this in a more structured fashion, where they invited people to send questions in advance over social media and by email. And I say I've got about 20-odd questions in front of me, but there's no way we're going to get through them all. So a couple of hours, when they were sent to me a couple hours ago, I kind of went through and picked out some that I thought covered some really important points. How we're going to go here is I'll put the question. I've already gone through and sort of flagged these generally to the representatives. So I'll put the question to the hall, and then we'll ask each of the party representatives to provide a 3-minute answer to the question. And we'll go in the same order that we've just gone through with our speakers. So with Mr. King, Mrs. Street, Mrs. Genter, Mr. Minto, and Mr. Barry. So we'll go in that fashion, and then once we finish with those answers, we'll move to the next question. In an hour, presuming that not everybody has to answer the questions. So if you haven't got anything to say, that's okay. We'll see if that ever happens. All right? Yeah. But anyways, so I think we'll probably get no more than four or so questions in before we wind up here at 8 o'clock. So here's the first question, and this question is for all the panelists. What are your party's policies towards reducing student debt and increasing support through student allowances and accommodation help, etc., for current students? Fire away.
Okay. Can you hear me in the back, or is that booming? Maybe booming. Look, effectively what the national government will do, or national party will do, is to ensure that there's good information for students to actually make decisions around the courses that they do take. There is not good information there at the moment, and the Minister is very conscious of that, and on that basis helping students to be able to get the training that they require, have the information about what is the pay rates on given courses before they actually undertake the situation, and be able to then get the support to be able to, so look, effectively the government has been very conscious of the cost on students, but they're also very aware of the cost on the taxpayer. So effectively the simple answer from the National Party is to ensure that students get good information so that they can make good choices on the degrees or qualifications that they take, that the government also, or the National Party also, grow the economy sufficiently so that when you do graduate, that you have good employment opportunities to go in and be able to pay off your student loans quicker. At the moment, the average student loan is paid off in 6.5 years, and on that basis, when we look at it from the point of view of 70% coming from the taxpayer and 30% from yourselves, we see that as being a good public good, private good balance. So effectively, that's how the National Party will be approaching the student loan situation and living allowances going forward. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'll just sit down for the Q&A bit. I've already said in my speech that Labor will review all student support, and with a view to obviously increasing student support. There are some things at the moment that are particularly laughable. The accommodation support is one of them, frozen at $40, which doesn't go very far when you live in Auckland. It doesn't go far when you live in Nelson and you want to go to NMIT. It doesn't go far. So that particular component of student support needs close scrutiny, because, as Julianne said earlier, students are the only people we require to borrow in order to live, and that doesn't seem right. Now, we actually believe that tertiary education is a public good, and it is something that benefits the whole of society. So we want to have a look again at student support. Can I just say a couple of other things quickly? One is that we will maintain the current 4% cap on fee increases. It's currently 4%, has been for a while. It still outstrips cost of living adjustment in most years. But if an institution thinks they require to increase fees by more than 2%, we will require them to justify that to government in writing. And there needs to be a very substantial justification. So we're looking to pegging it back to a 2% increase maximum. And on top of that, we want to lift the enrolment cap. So we want to have more people coming into universities, which may well also offset the need for increased fees. If we get time later, we can talk about what happens to people who've gone overseas, are now too scared to come back because of the interest that has accrued on their debt. That is shameful, and we need to do something about that.
Do you want to get it?
So as I said earlier, the Green Party is committed to immediately reinstating student allowances for postgraduate students and older students. We also want a review of the accommodation support with a view to increasing it, and free public transport off-peak. But we also want to work towards the establishment eventually of a fee-free tertiary education system. And so the way that we would do this is to cap and then progressively reduce student fees over time. We can't achieve it overnight, but I think it's something worth working towards. We once had it, and I think it benefited our society greatly, and there's no reason why we shouldn't strive to have that in the future. We also will explore a debt write-off scheme and change the repayments to reflect borrowers' ability to pay, increase the threshold and have tiered rates. And sorry, one other point about allowances. I think we're absolutely committed to working towards a universal student allowance as well. So it's really important that people have access to tertiary education. As Maryan said, it is a public good. It's something that benefits all of society. The market is notoriously bad at providing public goods, and that's why we have to do it if we want our society to benefit from having access to tertiary education.
Kia ora, everybody. Free tertiary education is our bottom line, and we believe we can do that, and we can do that very quickly. For students with existing debt, which I think this question is talking about, we would have the ability of students to run down that debt really quickly through community work, and we've got more details of that coming up tomorrow when our tertiary policy is announced, and even more, more details as time goes on. But that's something that we want to, we're obviously committed to free tertiary education. It's very difficult just to wipe the debt as it is, but it is possible to run it down really quickly, largely through things like community service and what have you. Kia ora.
When it comes to trying to run down the debt, making promises that we're going to make tertiary education free are completely irresponsible. We have a razor-thin surplus. We're $80 billion in debt. Where is the billions of dollars going to come from to fund this? It's just fanciful. The best way to help people run down their student loans is to create a dynamic economy where they can get a high-paying job and pay off their loan quickly. Simple as that. We can't give out things for free. There's no money in the bank. As far as student allowances, I think that should be left the same. Again, it would be fiscally irresponsible to raise them right now. Maryan mentioned the accommodation allowance, $40, you said? That's probably a symptom of a wider problem rather than the problem itself. The problem for people in Auckland is that we're in an inflated housing market which is caused by distortions to the market through an overactive Resource Management Act and an urban boundary which restricts land supply. That's why it's not enough, not because we need to be boosting up more benefits. Thank you.
thank you very much. Okay, we'll move to the second question here. Now, this is again a question for the whole panel. What changes, if any, does your party propose to make to cutbacks to core arts and science programs in favor of more profitable fields? So I've got to give this thing the way it is, right? So it's got quotes, so more profitable fields.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. The National Party makes no apologies for, accentuating the STEM subjects, the sciences, the technology, engineering and mathematics. That is not done completely out of the total exclusion of the humanities, of the arts and other such like things. But however, when you look at what our audience tonight will be expecting once they do graduate from with a degree or whatever, you will expect to have a buoyant, growing economy that is well resourced with qualifications of graduates, able to build infrastructure, be whatever, technologies, sciences and whatever. So from that point of view, what is very important to everybody in this country, the 4.5 million, is that we have those resources coming out of our higher learning institutions that can service the needs of our society and our environment. So just one point to finish off on, we've heard a lot tonight about the number of when people went to university and got a free education at university. Just remember that if you applied that model today, we'd actually be telling 2/3 of the people here tonight to go home, because only 1/10 of the, basically 10% of people in those days got a university education. If you didn't get your UE or get it accredited, you were told that there was no way back to university. So look, let's look at the positives of what are happening today. Let's build on that and be conscious that there is a social responsibility in gaining a higher education. And let's face it, when you do graduate, you'll be wanting a high-paying job, you'll be wanting to have services and things and an environment to be proud of, and that will require people with those skills, not to diminish the humanities, the arts and whatever. Thank you.
In my rushed little paragraph in my last 30 seconds in my opening speech, I mentioned two words. One was myopic and the other was utilitarian. And I think a myopic, utilitarian approach to tertiary education does no society any good. I think an historian, I'll use my history example again, an historian who is able to reflect back to us and reinterpret for us things that have shaped us, artists who reflect back to ourselves really cutting-edge images of who we are and who we've become, as well as who we have been. I think of the literary people, the poets and the writers who are able to assist us to define ourselves as a country, cannot be excluded from the future labour market. Can I just also say, while our theme, of course, is to vote positive, because we think we've got positive messages to give you good reasons to put your party vote with Labour, just a couple of negative points. The man who took 9 years to complete a zoology degree wants to end any entitlements to student support at 7 years. Talk about pulling the ladder up after you. That has no place in our tertiary education and planning, and besides which, I have no faith in the national government to plan our labour market needs. We had 14,500 apprentices in the system when we left government at the end of 2008, when we were booted out. That's a technical term. The Nats came in and ended the apprenticeship system. And now we're looking to import tradespeople to rebuild Christchurch. While Christchurch couldn't have been predicted, certainly a slump in the numbers of qualified tradespeople in our labour market could be. So I don't trust them to do that. One final comment. In Europe at the moment, they're talking about the emphasis on STEM subjects being deficient, and they want to put the A into STEM and make it STEAM. So if Europe is thinking that they cannot go without having arts as emphasised as all the other subjects, then I think it's good enough for us to consider that as well. The arts should not be missing in any tertiary system.
Completely agree with Maryan. It's really important that we have a diverse approach to education. I did my undergraduate at UC Berkeley in philosophy, and one of my really good friends studied peace and conflict studies, but he'd also taught himself computer science when he was in high school, and coding, and he went on to be a co-founder in a tech startup that's done incredibly well. So what you study at university is not necessarily what you go out and do in the world, and part of being a creative entrepreneur is having been exposed to a wide variety of subjects. And so the Green Party would reverse this current government's current tertiary strategy, which is so narrowly focused. And I have to say, it's very short term. They just have a very short term approach. And I don't think they're thinking long term in any area, particularly in the area of the economy. So it's absolutely essential that we invest in education in a diverse range of fields, that we support students to access that education. That's part of, without forcing them to take on crippling debt, which will in fact limit what our economy is able to do. The way that the relationship between students and society, I think, is one of, we invest in students and their ability to learn, and then they pay back with their contribution to society and taxes later. But doing it on this individual basis and saying we'd rather fund tax cuts to the people who are already wealthy, and then we're going to force individuals to take on debt before they've even commenced their careers, is completely backwards. Yes, there should be a sense of social responsibility, but it should be with the people who've already earned lots of money.
I agree very much with the two previous speakers. I think this government is absolutely hopeless at thinking ahead. And if you think about something like climate change, then you'll understand what I mean. And also the TPPA, those kinds of things. This is a short-term government following short-term business interests, and that's really what they see the role of tertiary education to be, to get people educated, to be cogs in some business machine somewhere. But the predictions are hopeless. The one point I would make is this, that I think when you come into tertiary education, I think that students should follow their passions. It is really important to follow your passion because you really get one crack at it. And as Julianne said, it may not be what you end up doing, but it will be something which enriches your life and enriches the whole community. Kia ora.
Now, the way I've interpreted the question is that arts courses are getting less popular. If that's the case, I think that perhaps we should just... Have I misinterpreted that?
Do you want me to give it to you again? Okay.
Yes, please.
It says, what changes, if any, does your party propose to make hold on. It's a multiple clause. What changes, if any, does your party propose to make to cutbacks to core arts and science programs in favour of more profitable fields?
I think that the funding should just follow the student, really. Let market forces decide.
All right, thank you very much. The next question pertains more to the role of the university more generally as opposed to students and courses. And it goes like, and it's for all the panelists. According to section 162, the Education Amendment Act, New Zealand universities are to be characterized by an acceptance of, quote, the role of critic and conscience of society, end quote. This role is coming under significant pressure as academics lose administrative support and their career progression is judged by the quantity of specialized publications instead of the quality of their public engagement. How will your party ensure our universities remain the critic and conscience of society? Okay.
Thank you. The National Party is a party of choice, freedom, aspiration and self-expression, and on that basis those values are what we expect out of our higher learning institutions, and it's actually enshrined in the Education Act 89 that the freedom of academic freedom and such like. So I would not agree with the questioner. I am very conscious though that freedom of speech and that academic critique of things is very much the strength of your democracy. So from that point of view, I don't believe that it is under threat, although one has to be very, very mindful that even the limitations put on the press or the media are often unintentionally is certainly a step in that direction. And even though as a politician we don't like to be criticised, the freedom of the press, the freedom of the higher learning institutions is critical to our democracy. Just want to make one point before I hand over the microphone. There's a comment that came out today or from the panel that the students are the only person or people that borrow to make a living or to get themselves educated to make a living. Can I suggest to you that anybody in the dairy industry that wants to become a contract milker, share milker or whatever has to borrow incredible amounts of money. There's a whole lot of people out there slaving away every day, ambitious for New Zealand, ambitious for themselves, and they borrow up to the gunnels. So look, make the most of your opportunities and make sure that the freedom of speech remains with you forever. Thank you.
Okay, Labor believes that the universities are in fact, as well as in statute, the critic and conscience of society. And it is as important to me that role is defended as in my role as Labor's spokesperson on state services, that a corruption-free public service and that gives ministers free and frank advice is defended as well. So that will be coming back with a Labor-led government too. Democratic institutions that you can believe in and ministers whose behaviour is transparent and accountable and you can trust. That's really critical. When it comes to the university's role, this government has moved against that role in a profound way in the Education Amendment Bill. And it has, by wanting to cut down the size of university councils, to take away the statutory representation of staff and students, of iwi, of community representatives, and by appointing by the minister more members and proportionately more members of a smaller council, gone to the heart of the independence and the autonomy of our universities. And that autonomy is threatened. There is an autonomy index that is part of the indices that go to create the rankings of universities. And people are very sensitive overseas to the autonomy of universities. I'll come back to this question shortly, I'm sure, but the government has moved in its own legislation against the protection of the role of the autonomy of universities and their role as critic and conscience.
I agree it's incredibly important that universities are the critic and conscience of society, and that people at the universities have the freedom and the ability to do important research and to speak out on the basis of their knowledge in ways that will help and enrich the public discourse and improve the debate, hopefully. And I think, so part of the problem here is actually the PBRF, the Performance-Based Research Fund, and that's something that the Green Party supports a comprehensive review of, because at the moment, it seems to lead to a much more competitive approach. There's huge pressure on academics to be publishing in international journals and not necessarily undertaking the research that's really relevant and important to New Zealand. So we'd like to investigate alternative funding models and ensure that we're getting the outcomes that we need, which is research that's directly relevant to New Zealand, that's going to help New Zealand, as well as research that's going to be published internationally. But also, we would like to improve staff to student ratios so that the focus isn't entirely on publication and research. I think teaching is really important as well. So.
Yeah, I think this role of the role of critic and conscience of society is extremely important. It's far more important than we might think. And I think it is under serious stress, and it has been for a long time. And the serious stress comes in a number of ways that have been mentioned before, but one of the ways is that there are now less full-time roles within departments at universities and more short-term jobs. And so without that stability of employment, it makes it more and more difficult for academics to be able to speak out. The other aspect of this that I do want to mention, because it's come up a couple of times now, and this is the idea of choice and freedom. I think choice and freedom are weasel words of neoliberalism, because if you think about what choice means, people with choices are people who have money, and people who have less choice have less money. And in reality, in the last 30 years, most people have got a lot less choice in their lives because we've had hundreds of thousands of families driven into poverty, while the extreme rich, while the rich become richer. This is inequality, which has caused an enormous stresses within families and within whole communities. And very last point is this. It used to be that students would pay a fee and students themselves would run student support services. What happens now, and that's a basic democratic model, students decide how they're going to run support services. What happens now is the students are levied, but they have no say in the provision of those services, and they're run by the university. So all this talk about compulsory student unionism or whatever is just rubbish. It's actually about students having control over the funding of the services that are run for students. That's actually quite fundamental to democracy.
Sounds like some people are sharing in some romanticism of their university days. University is a place where you pay money to get a qualification, and then you use that qualification in the workforce later. Collective consciousness, I don't know where this comes from. You just come here to learn, don't you?
I'd like to thank everybody for answering so quickly and briefly and succinctly. This means we're going to be able to get a question in here that I hadn't originally envisioned getting in, but I think I'm going to slide it in right now. All right, this again is for all panelists. I'd almost appreciate you turning the cameras off at this stage, but anyways, we're going to go forward. The University of Auckland's Vice-Chancellor, a public servant, is on according to this here, $660,000 a year salary, whilst under his vice-chancellorship, 100-odd necessary administrative staff are being axed, professors' sabbaticals have been slashed, and student fees have been raised. Well, he gives himself a 10% pay rise. Is this acceptable? And would your party address such discrepancies at the University of Auckland and at other New Zealand universities?
Okay, Auckland University is by far the largest university in New Zealand. It is also by far the highest ranked in the world. One thing that I would subscribe to is that if you have a Vice-Chancellor and you have a CEO, he has a council to report to, and he also has a minister to report to. And in that fact alone, if there's anybody that's held incredibly accountable, it will be the Vice-Chancellor. Now, it's all, I mean, like, it's basically, you could say, well, what's his name? Wayne Fife could be considered having got $2 million a year, laying off thousands of people, trying to make sure that our airline, which is our national carrier, remains solvent. Look, my view is that I am far from being qualified to tell your Vice-Chancellor how to run the best university in New Zealand. What he's achieved, when I look around and see the relationships that he's built up with business, where Auckland University qualifications will take you, you have got a qualification and an opportunity to a qualification which will put you head and shoulders above any other university in this country and a lot of other universities in Australasia. So I think he's doing a very good job. Thank you.
No one man ought to earn 600,000 while people are expected to
Thank you.
24.
Could I seek a reply? There was a very wise man by the name of Ian Rogers who said in 1931, you'll never get people out of poverty by taking money from the rich. So be mindful that if you're not careful and balanced in your policies, one thing the rich can do is pack their bags and leave.
Well, I think the woman who just interjected stole my speech. Labor has said that we will look at all of those large CEO salaries across the public service. We've said that we need to have a Royal Commission of Inquiry into the state of the state. And state sector salaries that are pitching up at around that rate are always justified on the basis of international competition. They're always justified in those terms. And people say MPs are overpaid. Well, I can tell you, when I was the Minister of ACC, the chair of the board of ACC at the time came to me and said, look, we're wanting to give the CEO of ACC a pay increase. And I said, well, what does she earn now? And he said, $600,000. And I said, God almighty, what does she want? And he said, about $640,000. I said, this is crazy stuff. This is crazy stuff. So I rang the State Services Commissioner, because it wasn't my decision as a minister. And I said, Commissioner, is this consistent with your guidelines for pay increases across the state sector this year? He said, no, it's not. I will have a talk with them. So I didn't dictate what that person should be paid, but I think we really do need to have a serious look at the amount of money that is being paid to state service CEOs. And that goes for Vice-Chancellors too. Just as a matter of interest, sir, you might like to know that the CEO was being paid about 3 times what I was being paid as the minister to whom she answered. But you know, that's as it is in New Zealand system. I think they do need looking at, and I think they do need curbing. These salaries do not make sense when we are looking at the vastly burgeoning gap between rich and poor in New Zealand.
Again, completely agree with Maryan. I think it's going to be one of those anomalies of the late 20th century that we look back on and laugh about. The idea that one individual could be responsible for the success or failure of a large organization, and that therefore they deserve to be remunerated many times the rate of the average worker. It's actually ridiculous. What those people are doing is just capturing a surplus that has been generated by the work of all the people in the organization. And I would say, you know, at the moment, Colin says that Stuart McCutcheon is responsible for this incredible institution, and therefore he deserves to be remunerated at this high rate, and that's the only way we could attract someone to do this job. But actually, I mean, he probably shouldn't have that much responsibility, that burden of responsibility on his shoulders. It should be more fairly shared out. Both the responsibility and the rewards should be more fairly shared. And that's going to be the trick to developing a sustainable economy in the long term. Because inequality, which is growing across the world and in New Zealand, is bad for everyone. You can't tell me that people who are earning huge amounts of money want to live in a society where there are homeless people, where there are higher levels of crime, where there are huge burdens on the health system. But that's what will happen. You know, I don't believe people choose to live where they live because they can earn more money after they're already earning enough to have a very comfortable lifestyle, or because they pay lower tax. The research doesn't bear that out. The research suggests that tax rates have very little to do. People choose to live places because they're nice places to live, and they're nice places to live if there isn't huge amounts of poverty and inequality. So the Green Party, I think, absolutely, we thought we would start with MP salaries. So we have a new policy for MP salaries, where we say they would be linked to movements in median income. So if the median income in New Zealand goes down, MPs' salaries go down. If median income increases, then MPs see some incentive, but ultimately it would be the nominal changes that we would accept, because we want to start reducing the gap between people who earn too much, like MPs, and the rest of New Zealanders.
I would agree with linking MP salaries to the median wage, provided we do a big cut in MP salaries first, because back 30 years ago, MP salaries used to be linked to what a certain grade of secondary school teacher was paid, and that's just that kind of link has been broken a long time ago. You know, if Stuart McCutcheon were living in the 1980s, he would be paying, under Colin's National Party, he would have been paying the highest tax rate of 66%, right? Now, what's happened in the last 30 years, that 66% was slashed back to 33%, which is what Labor did in the 1980s. So we have, so the big salaries were attracting much higher tax, and rightly so. Stuart McCutcheon is doing a job that any competent administrator could do for probably a third or a quarter of the salary that he's getting. But Stuart McCutcheon's getting that big fat salary because he's very right-wing, and because he is pushing this university harder and harder into the space of business, links with business. That's why he's there. If he wasn't doing that job, the government would have got rid of him a long time ago.
Just a quick point about the tax cuts under the Labor government in the 1980s. When that top rate of tax went down from 66% to 33%, not only did it reduce tax avoidance, but it generated so much economic growth that the government got more in revenue from that lower top rate than it used to get at 66%. Now, as far as the job cuts here, I understand 1,000 was the figure in the question?
According to the question, it's 100.
100. Okay. Looking at the number itself doesn't really... You can't come up with a proper answer from that, because you have to understand what they're actually doing. And now another Roger Douglas example will be, back in the 80s, we used to have the post office. They would build and assemble their own trucks. instead of just importing them from overseas. And in the railways, we had people who dug coal out of the ground at a faster rate than what the market demanded. So because coal spontaneously catches on fire if it's left sitting around, we then had to employ people whose whole job was to hose the coal down. So numbers of people losing their jobs doesn't necessarily indicate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in itself. What the Vice-Chancellor could be doing is making the university more efficient, and if he is, he probably deserves a salary.
So Steve is staff member 101. We might cut that out of the internet feed.
Thank you, I appreciate it. All right, for this one, we're going to move to some more quite specific details here. So this is a question again for the entire panel. New Zealand is ranked close to the bottom of the OECD in terms of science funding, and the career path for young scientists is broken due to a near complete absence of funding for postdoctoral research fellowships, with there being just 5 postdoctorate fellowships offered per year by the Royal Society of New Zealand after the Foundation for Research, Science and Technology postdoctorate fellowships were scrapped in 2011. By comparison, the Australian Research Council's Discovery Early Career Researcher Award offers 200 postdoctorate fellowships per year. How does your party plan to rectify this major problem in New Zealand science?
The National Party is very aware that as a country we lag behind the OECD as far as science funding goes. That having been said, when you look at the amount that the Crown actually fronts up for science funding, it is not too badly off. The big challenge for New Zealand is to have business invest equitably in science. So effectively what we've got here is sort of a culture where the Crown is looked to do all the science funding. And one thing that the Auckland University has got to be congratulated in doing is building those business relationships and attracting a greater amount of real business science funding. So that having been said, the national government is increasing the cores, which is the Centres of Research Excellence, from 6 to 10. We've increased the percentage of funding into science, and we've also lifted the science funding for the PBRF up to $300 million. And that, in my view, is probably, in my time in Parliament, the biggest lift in science funding that we have seen. Around the postdoctoral funding, it does seem very low to me as a layman. 5 against 200. I would expect it to be nearer 40 on balance by population. However, that will be no doubt something that will be looked at as we keep on building the economy and you back a government led by the National Party with a policy and direction that it knows it's going. Thank you.
Can I just say a couple of things about the whole research environment? Certainly Labor has said in our policy, and copies of this are available for you on the desk outside as you leave, but we have said that we will review the criteria around the PBRF in order to ensure that, that there's a broad range of research that is recognised. I think that needs a bit of consideration at the moment. Secondly, the Marsden Fund remains hugely important, and we need to make sure that that is sustainable, because that is about fundamental research, about blue skies research, about clever ideas that suddenly take off, and we must always allow for that. As far as science is concerned, the government's latest effort at promoting science research was with the Science Challenge, and it seems by all accounts I said hardly because I don't like to be exclusive about these things, but I don't remember meeting a single person who thought that was anything other than an unmitigated disaster. So if there are to be investments in science research, then let's gather a few scientists together, shall we, to talk about how that should be done. And finally, I've said that one of the things that we will look at in student support is scholarships, and that needs to go to postdoctoral as well. We've said that we will reinstate, even before the review of student support, we will reinstate the entitlement to allowances and loans for postgraduate students, but we need to consider the support that we offer postdoctoral students as well. We need to be able to support our brightest and best in every area, and well, I'll just leave that there for now on science. Thanks.
So I mentioned one of our 3 priorities in this election campaign is a smarter economy, and the biggest announcement that we had around that was upping the investment in research and development. That's not specifically in science, but it certainly will encompass science research. And it's true that New Zealand's got very low levels of research and development generally in the OECD, and what they've found in other countries is that when the government kicks in more investment, it tends to be met by the private sector and matched by it. So what we need to do is increase the government's investment in R&D in order to get the private sector coming to the table. And the way to do that, we thought it was really interesting that the national government cut the R&D tax credits and instead went to this command and control model, which, in fact, if you look at a lot of their government policies, they seem to do. They seem to take a real central planning approach rather than a market-based approach. Stephen Joyce and MB sit around and they give out grants to companies they like for doing research projects they like, but we think we don't know everything down in Wellington, and although there's some usefulness in the grant scheme as it exists now, we wouldn't want to cut it completely. We want to increase the funding in the form of research and development tax credits so that it's available to anyone who's going to be doing that, and that should generate more of the jobs that are going to allow career paths for people who are studying science. We also said that we would allow for 1,000 new places in the STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and that would just be additional funding to the universities. I don't think we have any specific policy on postdoc fellowships, but I'm sure it's the sort of thing that we would want to support and have more of, but it's not something that we have in our policy at the moment.
There is a reason why New Zealand is close to the bottom of the OECD in the science funding, which has been talked about, and that's because New Zealand has had a much more extreme version of this free market economics than most countries. And the idea is that the market, the private sector, will provide this research. And in reality, the private sector is pretty useless at research. The private sector is good at exploiting ideas to make profits, but they're not good at the actual research. And if you look at the last 100 years, the major breakthroughs in science have occurred by scientists doing research for the public good. That's simply the reality. And there isn't enough of that funding in New Zealand at the moment, and there needs to be.
I find myself in a really strange situation right now because we've got the Mana and the Green Party advocating corporate welfare when the ACT Party doesn't want to give out money to corporates. Isn't that strange? Clearly, if we've only got 5 being funded by the Crown, it's obviously a system that's not working. And picking winners by the government most definitely will not work. I mean, if politicians had the next big idea, they'd be out doing it themselves. They wouldn't be politicians. ACT's answer to this is, instead, to cut the corporate tax rate to 20% next year and then to 12.5% by 2020. And we will fund this by eliminating all corporate welfare. The amount of money that you get out of corporate tax actually isn't that much. It's about $300 million per percentage point. but the amount of economic growth that you gain from cutting it is enormous, and our alternative budget has shown that you could add a full point to economic growth by reducing that tax rate to 12.5%. So the answer is stop taking so much money off the private sector and trying to apportion it through politicians, and just let the private sector do what it does best, which is come up with the next big idea and make money out of it.
We are coming towards the evening's close. This is going to be the last question, and it's a bit of a double-barreled one, so listen carefully. That's okay, I'll remind you again if you lose it. Okay, so this is it. First, what you've heard tonight or read over the past little while, what are the largest flaws in the other parties' tertiary education policies, and what's the best policy idea that you've heard tonight from one of the other representatives? Or, if you must, what's the worst?
Okay. Right.
Mike.
Ask the question again, please.
Sure. What is the largest flaws in an other party's tertiary education policy? Also, but what is also the best policy? So I want to know what's the biggest problem and what's the best thing you've heard from other parties going forward?
Okay, thank you. In my view, the worst elements of the Labour and Green and Mana parties' tertiary education policies is that they believe throwing money at something solves the problem. And what I would do is I would use, by way of illustration, the health sector. When Labour was in government, they doubled the budget and they didn't increase any more, they didn't increase the outputs. So basically they doubled the funding and retained the same level of outputs. So when I actually hear the socialists on the left talk about spending everybody's money, I become very, very concerned. It doesn't worry me much because, just by way of curiosity, you may be interested to know I go on to the superannuation next year at 65, but I've actually got 4 children and 12 grandchildren. And if Labor gets in, or the Greens and Mana, and they think throwing money at the issue is going to solve it, then I think they are very, very wrong. It has to be far more strategic. I acknowledge that you can push things too far and try and get blood out of a stone, which is never going to work anyway. So that's the policy that I find, fundamentally flawed. The best policy that I've heard, again, comes from the Labor, Greens and Mana, because I'm training to be an accountant and I'm looking forward to their credits for research and development, because that's going to mean a lot more work for me as an accountant when I leave politics, with adjusting all my clients' accounts and actually getting the maximum rort out of the system that can possibly be achieved for those wealthy bastards that make heaps of money.
I think probably the worst thing that I've heard, or arguments, and the reason is not immediately obvious, but the worst thing I've heard has been the really good enunciation of ACT policies from the ACT guy. And the reason I have trouble with it is that he's begun to make the National Party look tolerable. And they're not. They are short-sighted, ungenerous, and completely lacking in vision when it comes to tertiary education. Good arguments I've heard. Well, every time Julianne Genter and I say we agree with each other, that sounds like a good idea to me. And I still say party vote Labor.
Yeah, I don't want it to be broken down on these this left-right spectrum, because I think it's much more complex than that. But I think what you've seen tonight is a real clear difference between ways of looking at the world. And I think that the National Party and the ACT Party, particularly the ACT Party, I think, live in a world of pure theory. If you look at the sort of policies they're advocating, there's no evidence of them working anywhere in the world. It's entirely an ivory tower thing, really persuaded by Ayn Rand and that over-reliance on individual rationality as being in the market as being the solution to everything. I'm not opposed to using markets where there's evidence that they work, but that's not the same as privatizing everything. So I really disagree with the idea that education is a commodity and should be treated as such. I think it is a public good. I think there's good sense in investing in it. I think it's possible to do so in a way that's not just throwing money at a problem. I don't think that's what the Green Party is advocating. We're not advocating throwing money at things. In fact, we're advocating spending less money in many areas where there's no evidence to support spending money, like, for example, on the government's roads of national significance that have never undergone any sort of business case and make no economic rational sense. So while National claims to be the party of economic rationality and fiscal discipline, if you look at the numbers, it's just not true. And it's not at all true that Labour and Greens are proposing big spending increases. We're proposing fully costed budgets that change the emphasis of where we're spending money to get better outcomes for people and the environment, which will inevitably help our economic development in prosperity in the long term. That's not very specific, but in terms of good ideas, I think Maryan Street outlined a whole lot of detailed policy in the tertiary education sector that I could agree with. And John Minto, I absolutely agree with free education, but I don't think we can achieve it overnight. I think it's something that we have to start from where we are and work to something better. And so and you don't just have to. I mean, you can change the government by party voting Green as well.
I'm very happy to sit here on the left with Julianne, even if she doesn't recognise it. Look, I think the biggest flaw that I've heard tonight was from National and ACT, because they want to keep on throwing money at the rich. Now, when has that ever worked, just throwing money at the rich? They're doing it through the taxation system, and I think it's wrong. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So throwing money at the rich, that's the flaw. Now the second one, the best I've heard tonight, besides internet manas policy, the best policy I heard tonight was when the Greens talked about capping and then cutting and reducing to zero tertiary education fees.
Definitely the worst policy I've heard tonight is the idea that we can have free tertiary education. It is a blatant bribe. As I said before, the surplus is razor thin. We're $80 billion in debt as a government. It is not affordable. And the Green Party say that they have costed their budget. Infometrics, the company that worked for them, actually said that their estimations on what their new tax rate would bring in was more than double what it actually will bring in, so I'd be very suspicious of that. The best comment I've heard from my opponent tonight was actually from someone in the audience, and it went...
It's an interesting note to end on. I hope you'll all join me in giving a warm round of thanks to the Reason and Science Society, a member of which is going to come up here to close the event. That's Ben Fulton.
Well, first off, I want to thank all of you for coming here. I know that it's during the university break and that a lot of you have quite a bit of studying to do, so I really appreciate you having a lot of interest in this enough to come out during this time. The second group I want to thank is the New Zealand University Students Association. with helping us to organise this debate in terms of advertising and in terms of informing people about what's happening, as well as providing funding for it. The third group I want to thank is the Reason Science Society itself for all this work to get all the MPs together, design all the advertising, print it all out, and advertise across the university and devote a ton of time towards it. And the last thing I would like to, second last would be our camera team over there to provide recordings, and we really appreciate you helping us to do this. And my final thanks would be to our politicians themselves for really coming out here and showing a lot of interest to debate these issues. And as a result, here's a token of thanks for all of you.
Okay, look, just put your hands together and thank Steve and Ben for putting it in on behalf of the panel up here. We've had a lot of fun. Trust you have had a lot of fun. So put your hands together for Steve's done a great job, and for Ben. Thank you very much.
That was very enjoyable. Thank you very much. Very simple, very simple. I should hope so. You have a Canadian running things.
You are good Melbourne Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah. Just a couple of notes. We will be having refreshments at the ONG Glen foyer, just over there. So if you want to come around and continue the discussion there, that would be greatly appreciated. And thanks for coming.